Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah?
So, from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah, questioning him in those terms, and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense.
To claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous. The high priest asks him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And then virtually quoting from Daniel, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power. And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, you have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need? And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So, from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even.
Right.
There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy, going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your question,
Interpretation,
Ben.
yes.
Yeah, your
Mhm, mhm,
interpretation,
mhm.
Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
Let's address this first. Why is Jesus' understanding of the messianic figure different than any other? Because that's what it is about. Throughout Jewish history, several figures were hailed as potential messiahs, often because of their military leadership, nationalistic zeal, or efforts to restore Israel's sovereignty. Men like Judas Maccabeus or Simon Bar Kokhba were seen as deliverers during times of oppression. However, Jesus of Nazareth's claim to be the Messiah was fundamentally unique, not only in what he did or taught, but in who he claimed to be. Most messianic figures were expected to be political liberators, kings or warriors who would restore the throne of David, defeat Israel's enemies, and usher in an age of peace. Jesus, however, redefined messiahship through suffering, humility, and sacrificial love. Rather than rallying an army, he spoke of loving one's enemies and laying down his life for others. His path led to a Roman cross, not a royal throne, yet he claimed this was precisely how the Messiah must fulfill the scriptures. Luke 24:25-27. But Jesus went even further than redefining the messianic role. What makes his claim truly unparalleled in religious history is that he claimed to be divine, not merely a prophet, teacher, or anointed one, but God in the flesh. He said in John 8:58, "Before Abraham was, I am," using the divine name revealed to Moses. He claimed the authority to forgive sins in Mark 2:5-7, something only God could do. He accepted worship in John 20:28, equated himself with the Father in John 10:30, and promised to return in glory to judge the world in Matthew 25:31-32. No other messianic figure in Jewish tradition, or in any major world religion, ever made such claims without being dismissed as blasphemous or delusional. In Judaism, the Messiah was expected to be anointed by God, but not God himself. Jesus shattered that expectation by claiming to be both the Son of Man and the Son of God, fully human and fully divine. Moreover, his resurrection validated his unique identity. While other messianic movements died with their leaders, Jesus' followers boldly proclaimed that he rose from the dead, conquering sin and death. This launched a global movement not based on national identity or military conquest, but on faith, grace, and the indwelling of God's Spirit. I will sum up by saying, Jesus' uniqueness lies not just in what he taught or how he fulfilled prophecy, but in who he claimed to be. He is the only figure in history to be worshipped by billions as both Messiah and God, the eternal Word made flesh. His claim combines messianic fulfillment, divine identity, and universal salvation, a combination found nowhere else in human history.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, what, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, I mean, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
You know, on the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right, the Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. And they still do that 20 years after his death. You know, that's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, you know, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity.
Many don't understand. Why do people say that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the rise of Christianity? It's one of the most important ones when you're trying to understand why Christianity even exists today. So think about it. After Jesus was crucified, his disciples weren't out boldly starting a religion. They were hiding, scared, and pretty much convinced the whole thing was over. In Jewish culture at the time, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction. It was a sign that someone was cursed by God, not chosen by him. No one was expecting their Messiah to die and certainly not to come back to life. So something had to have happened that completely flipped their outlook. And what the disciples ended up preaching wasn't some vague idea like, Jesus lives on in our hearts, or his message will never die. No, they went out saying he physically rose from the dead. They claimed to have seen him, touched him, talked with him, and not just one or two people. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, says that over 500 people saw him alive at once. That's a bold claim to make, especially when many of those eyewitnesses were still alive and could be asked about it. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. You have skeptics, people like James, Jesus' own brother, and Paul, who was literally trying to destroy the Christian movement, who both had radical encounters with the risen Jesus and completely changed the direction of their lives. James became a leader in the church in Jerusalem, and Paul became its biggest missionary. That kind of turnaround doesn't just happen because of a rumor or a story. Something real had to confront them. And yeah, people have tried to come up with other explanations. Like maybe the disciples hallucinated it, or they made it up. But none of those theories really hold water when you look at the details. Hallucinations don't happen to groups. Legends take decades to develop, but the resurrection was being preached within months or a couple of years after Jesus died. Right in Jerusalem, where people could have gone to the tomb and checked for themselves. And stealing the body? Why would the disciples do that just to get tortured, jailed, or killed for a lie? They had nothing to gain. Honestly, when you lay it all out, the resurrection just makes the most sense. It explains how a small, scared group of people suddenly became this bold, world-changing movement. It explains why people were willing to die for what they believed they saw. And it explains why Christianity didn't just survive. It exploded across the Roman Empire and eventually the world. So yeah, the resurrection isn't just a nice spiritual idea. It's the heartbeat of the entire Christian faith, and historically it's the best explanation for how Christianity even got off the ground. Now, let's address the gap problem between Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels. A lot of people assume that the Gospels were written centuries later, like they're just legendary stories that evolved over a long period of time. But when you actually look at the historical timeline, the gap between Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels is shockingly short, especially by ancient standards. Let's break this down. Most scholars, even secular ones, agree that Jesus died around 30 to 33 AD. Now, the Gospel of Mark, which most believe is the earliest gospel, was likely written somewhere around 65 to 70 AD. That's a gap of about 35 to 40 years, which in ancient history is incredibly close. Think about it. That would be like someone today writing about events that happened in the 1980s or 1990s. That's within living memory. And here's the kicker. The gap might even be smaller when you consider the early Christian creeds and oral traditions that predate the Gospels. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes a creed about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection that scholars believe was circulating within just a few years, like 3 to 5 years, after Jesus' crucifixion. That's not legend building. That's people immediately passing on what they claim they saw. Plus, Paul's letters, like Romans, Galatians, and 1 Corinthians, were written in the 50s AD, just 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and they already contain key teachings and events found in the Gospels. That means these core beliefs weren't slowly made up over time. They were already central to the Christian movement very early on. Now, think about this too. During that time, many eyewitnesses were still alive. If the Gospel writers were making stuff up, inventing stories about miracles or the resurrection, people could have called them out. But the early Christian message spread fast and wide, right in the same areas where the events took place. You can't pull that off unless people are genuinely convinced that what you're saying actually happened. So no, we're not dealing with myths that formed generations later. The Gospels were written within a historically tight window after Jesus' life, and they're based on eyewitness testimony, oral tradition, and early creeds that go back to the very beginning of the movement. That doesn't automatically prove they're true, of course, but it does mean they're historically serious and not just religious folklore. I hope this video helped you understand historical Christianity more than the false narrative you heard somewhere out there. I can't wait to see you in the video, and may God bless you.